This is the second lecture in week 15 for Earth Changing Climate. And what I want to do here is look at how the state of Pennsylvania has built its climate adaptation plan under Governor Wolf. And again, this is the 2021 Pennsylvania Climate Adaptation Plan that in a lot of respects imitates that of the federal government. I want to begin, though, when we look at Pennsylvania, one of the things that the Wolf administration identified was that the sectors of emissions and therefore their climate adaptation plan addresses are somewhat different. It is very similar to, if you will, look at the national emissions, but notice in Pennsylvania that we do have a couple of slight differences. First of all, of course, electricity generation is still number one. Transportation is number two. But notice this one right here. We do have, because of our natural gas production in the state, we do have a larger proportion of fugitive emissions in terms of energy production. That is methane leaking from our natural gas wells, specifically the fracking that goes on with the Marcellus Shale. So the adaptation plan, understand, also does have a mitigation goal in terms of greenhouse gases. But again, we're not going to focus on that right now. What I would like to focus on is the vulnerability assessment. And again, this comes right out of the document, but I do want to point out these because it's important in terms of how we live. And so one of the things that comes out very clearly is we're going to be warmer here. Our annual temperature is going to be, on average, about 6 degrees hotter. We will have more weeks, okay, have an average of 5 to 8 weeks over 90 degrees every year. If we go back to 1971 to 2000, it was only 5 days. And so again, significantly longer stretches of higher degree days. We should have also warmer, wetter winters. So again, warmer and wetter doesn't necessarily mean no snow. It actually means potentially greater snowfall. We will also increase intensity of extreme weather events. We are going to have in Pennsylvania, at least the data suggests, this very uneven periods of high precipitation to drought. And so again, that is a significant issue. Also, on our coastal areas, we will see a rise in sea level. Lake Erie's water levels are going to change significantly, as is the temperature of the water. So if we think about this, if we kind of take it apart, what we have are some vulnerabilities in the area of how we experience temperatures. So cities of Pittsburgh, Allentown, Philadelphia, Erie are all going to have the potential of hotter, more intense urban experiences. We are also going to see changes in our agricultural systems based on access to moisture, soil moisture, precipitation, and its timing, and our growing season. We will also see coastal and lake level changes. So clear identification of vulnerability within the state. Now, what is important, and again, the Pennsylvania one is quite useful in terms of how adaptation pathways are identified. And there's two of them that I want to talk about here. And again, these come from the details. The Climate Action Plan is quite detailed and quite lengthy. But I kind of wanted to pull these out to see how adaptation strategies work. And so if we look at this, this is an adaptation pathway to deal with the storm water. And so again, we understand that it is likely that Pennsylvania will experience more extreme weather events, and that means quite often high levels of flooding. So again, foundational strategy, and this is, in other words, what we start with is the idea of how do we deal with a specific challenge. That is, we're going to have more flooding. Flooding relates to stormwater. So what the first idea is encourage adoption of adaptive design and flood management practices. So adaptive design, in other words, we have to design as we modify, improve, or update our stormwater systems. We have to have adaptive design. We have to know that these things are potentially going to change. So what's the strategy? In other words, we have to do this. We have to encourage adoption of adaptive design. Okay, how do we do that? Well, A, we have to provide funding. And B, We have to provide technical assistance to local governments that may not have the best practices or even have the technological expertise to deal with that. Who does that? Well, again, so notice that you have foundational strategy, an actionable strategy, and then who's involved? The actors? Well, the state legislature has to deal with this. And then a time structure. Again, this is that idea of saying priorities. What is a priority? This is a very high priority. So again, then from that foundational, then you move forward. In this case, they're saying identify the systems in flood risk or flood prone areas. So not every city, every community has this problem. You have to identify them. Stormwater systems, so determine which stormwater systems to protect or retrofit. Build a framework to do that. The actors, though, here have to be local public works departments. And then the timing here is, well, you got to have funding for it. So we go with kind of these very broad statements. Then you'll notice that what is the approach? Harden, protect, and relocate at-risk assets. Public work departments, or improve research and analysis. These are the two things we have to do. We have to increase resilience. So in other words, hardening a system essentially means make it so that it can tolerate far more stormwater. Okay? And so that's a resilience approach. The idea of improving research and analysis, this develop stormwater billing system to create more equitable fee structures, say, well, okay, how do we get to that hardening? Well, we have to do that financially. And how do we do that? Through a taxation system or a fee system within municipalities. So you'll notice that this is, in fact, a concrete action plan primarily designed towards resilience. In a similar way, we have, remember I had said a few minutes ago, this issue of the urban temperature problems. In other words, it's clear that our urban areas are going to experience much higher temperatures and many more days above 90 degrees. And so one of the things that we have to deal with that is that these are going to be in areas that are oftentimes overburdened in terms of their electric generation capacity, and they are also quite often lower income areas, that is vulnerable populations. And so again, foundational actions, we start at the top. Establish metrics, and so we need to be able to measure. Then we need to identify key policies. And again, notice the idea of environmental justice comes into play here. So it's not just to say we're going to deal with urban heat islands, but we have to look at where there is inequity in terms of access to financial assistance for things like air conditioning. It might be as basic as planting trees in low-income areas. Identify processes to assess equity and challenges and risks. So again, the first part of this is really identification of the problems, the vulnerabilities in terms of the urban areas. Then you'll notice that the strategies are in fact to reduce vulnerability and impacts. In other words, build resilience and increase adaptation. And so, for example, and I want to get down to the bottom that Pennsylvania put forward, one, create grants for community-based resilience projects. Okay, so what do you do to build resilience? Well, you have to provide money. Then we have the idea of existing coping practices. Again, what existing resilience is built into the system? Study informal heat wave event coping practices. Support emergency plans. In this respect, we are looking at a community or communities and saying, okay, what are they doing already? Then, of course, as I noted earlier, improve infrastructure in vulnerable communities. And notice, again, some of these are really quite simple. Planting trees and creating cooling shelters. Many times, again, you have populations of low income that cannot immediately adapt. So as we go on, you'll notice that there are things that are very rapid to do, and then there are those things that go on that are somewhat slower. Develop, maintain, analyze, metric tracking, etc. Establish programs for funding streams, and then assess the hazards. So Pennsylvania has built a very specific strategy to deal with their vulnerabilities. And again, this is a good case study of how states or smaller entities do the groundwork that the federal government sets up as a very broad idea. Again, something as concrete as increasing urban forestry, that is tree cover, in low-income areas is quite effective, and in fact is quite cost-effective as well. But it requires the identification of these vulnerabilities before we can adapt and build resilience. Now, again, this is a case study of Pennsylvania's climate adaptation. In the next lecture, we will be looking at your individual strategies. And again, it's a fairly brief lecture that I'm going to ask you to think about how you can do these things in terms of your own adaptation and mitigation. We'll see you in the next lecture.